Welcome to the Debrief, Carolina Journal's weekly recap of major developments in politics and public policy in North Carolina. I'm Mitch Kokai, sitting in for Donna King, and today we're going to take a little bit of a different trek. Instead of taking a look at the top headlines of the week, we're going to look at some issues that have some more long-term significance, and I'm joined by an expert panel for that topic and for that discussion. Andy Jackson, next to me, is the director of the Civitas Center for Public Integrity at the John Locke Foundation. Welcome, Andy. We also have joining us Donald Bryson, who is the CEO of the John Locke Foundation, and Brooke Medina, who is Vice President of Communications at Locke. Well, state lawmakers recently returned to Raleigh to deal with what everyone is promising is going to be a short election year session. We'll see if that actually happens. They'll have to tweak the two-year budget plan and take care of some other major pressing issues. Donald, as the head of the John Locke Foundation, what does Locke want to see the General Assembly do this time around?
Well, for people who got their print edition of the latest Carolina Journal, and I hope that they did, you'll turn into page 2 and you'll see that I hope that it's a very short legislative session, although I feel like I might be Charlie Brown with Lucy holding the football here on this. We've been promised short long sessions and short sessions for the past 10 years, and I think they've delivered once, maybe. But hopefully they will be. We should
probably remind people that in the odd number year, that's supposed to be a long session.
It is.
And the short session in an even year, election year, is supposed to be really short.
Right. So traditionally, they're supposed to come in the year after election years, in odd number years, in January, and be out around early July, shortly after the end of the fiscal year on June 30th, and then the short session in even numbered years and election years is actually not mandated by the Constitution. This is a fabrication of the General Assembly itself. But traditionally what they come in late April, early May, and they're supposed to be out around the early part of July. That has rarely happened over the past 10 years, but we hope that it does. So one of our priorities is to get them out of town as quickly as possible. We have some other priorities, mainly because it's a budget-focused session. We want to make sure that just because they're Republicans and ostensibly conservative doesn't mean that they're going to not spend the people's money. We would like them to keep spending low and controlled. Don't raise taxes, obviously. We have had the opportunity to be one of the several states in the past couple of years to universalize our school choice programs. And that's been great. We had 72,000 people across the state apply. Unfortunately, there's a funding shortfall of about $288 million on the Opportunity Scholarship Program, so we hope that they shore up and do spend that money. And there is money there because we know that the state has taken in $400 million more than they anticipated, so we have a revenue surplus, unlike a lot of states in our country, and so we're in a good spot. But with that, we know that there is very likely, we've run the math here at the John Locke Foundation, and there's probably going to be an overrun on state Medicaid costs. If only there had been, a public policy organization who for the past 12 years has been saying that you will have cost overruns if you expand Medicaid. But there is likely going to be around a $400 million cost overrun on Medicaid. So those are things that we're watching and concentrating on as we get into the short session.
And I know one thing that's of interest is if there's going to be an expansion of the Opportunity Scholarships, the voucher program for families in North Carolina, there's one piece of money that they could use that would actually make for a policy change in the right direction that could provide that money. That's right.
NC Innovation is a nonprofit that got $250 million of taxpayer money last year. They're scheduled to get another $250 million. That's million with an M. That's a lot of money. Carolina Journal, Jeff Moore at Carolina Journal in particular, has done a good job of covering what's been going on. They've only just now started a pilot program of the type of grants they're going to put out, which is to convert applied research at public universities and sort of help them get through, those researchers get through the venture capital valley of death, is what they call. It's a great role for the private sector, but maybe not to put taxpayers on the hook. I think a better use of taxpayer money would be to take that $250 million, apply it to the school voucher program, which has been around for 10 years, has a track record and demand, and then maybe let's take a beat on NC Innovation and come back to it at another time.
Yeah, very interesting stuff. Brooke, what are you looking for during this legislative session?
Well, I think there's going to be a tomato sandwich day, so I'm looking forward to that for sure. but also just, being a voice for North Carolina taxpayers there at the General Assembly. Like Donald spoke about, the importance of making sure we're getting those allocations of resources right. That matters when it comes to student school choice. So it's great that we have this program that's been expanded. How are we going to fund it correctly? We do have lots of surpluses. We also have lots of sort of hidden money in areas that the John Locke Foundation is going to be tracking and making sure that that is spent well, that it is spent wisely and in the interest of taxpayers. So I think a lot of this is going to actually center on investigating really how the General Assembly is allocating those funds and making sure that they're using them in a way that actually honors taxpayer. And we're a nonprofit. We understand what donor intent means. Taxpayers are sometimes forcibly becoming donors, of course, in some ways. And so we want to make sure that their money is going to the right places and not there to just prop up venture capital enterprises that maybe they don't agree with.
Make transparency great again.
Hear, hear.
Yeah,
I agree with
great
that.
idea. And we have talked on this program before about the reserve funds and how that helps hide the amount of increased spending that the General Assembly can engage in. How about on the election front? Anything special that the General Assembly needs to do?
Well, there's a couple of things. The first thing that comes to mind is we made a correct choice here in North Carolina to move the deadline for absentee mail ballots from 3 days after Election Day to Election Day, but there wasn't a corresponding shift in the deadline to request absentee ballots. So they're still on the same date. So you have this shortened window from when people can request ballots and when they can get sit in, and that may increase the likelihood that ballots will come in too late, because people, if they wait until the deadline to request the ballot, they get it, then they have a very short, just a few days turnaround to get that back in. So we should adjust the deadline to request ballots probably about 4 days later. Another thing that we're looking at, something that had some momentum before and seems to be picking up a little bit, is citizens-only voting in North Carolina, a constitutional amendment. We already have it by statute in North Carolina, but this is really a fundamental question about how we operate our republic, who can vote, who can't vote, and so I think that deserves to be a constitutional amendment. Relatedly, we have been pushing here at Locke for a long time to remove the literacy tests from North Carolina's Constitution. It's a vestige of the Jim Crow era. It's not enforced anymore, thank goodness, but it still is a black eye on the state. We'd like to get that taken out of our Constitution.
Lots of interesting stuff. I'm going to come right back to you because in addition to the legislative session, of course, 2024, a huge year for elections. We've got all the important horse races, president, governor, other major issues. But there are some other election-related things that are worth noting, and that's what you do at the Civitas Center for Public Integrity. What's one thing that you're watching that's coming up actually in a matter of a couple of weeks?
Yeah, well, one thing that's coming up, we have a second primary in North Carolina. And so we have a couple of council state races. We have the 13th congressional district race coming up. And as usual, we're going to expect turnout to be much lower in the second primary compared to what we had in the first primary.
And the first primary wasn't huge either.
It wasn't huge, it never is. And for the rest of the world, they're often called runoff elections. We call them second primaries technically here in North Carolina. Ours is on May 14th, is coming around the bend. And this brings up an issue where the party nominees, and all of these are Republican now at this point. There was one Democratic runoff in Orange County, but one of the candidates has stepped down, so it looks like that's not going to be happening there. I mean, it's technically happening, but it's not moving forward. Is that you're going to have a very small sliver of party voters selecting the nominee, plus the state has to pay for this. And so there's occasional suggestions for alternatives. The problem is none of those alternatives are perfect either. We have the idea, I used to live in Nebraska, they had a situation where the governor was nominated, I think, on 24% of the vote in their Republican primary. So we could do something like that, which is what we have for the general election, where you just say whoever gets the most votes wins, even if you don't get a certain threshold. Some states are moving towards ranked choice voting. That's where instead of, if you have 10 candidates, you would say this is my first choice, my second choice, my third choice. That has problems of its own. It makes the ballot a lot more complicated. And also, who you're voting for on that day, that's different information than if you have a runoff and you're down to two people. And so you're really kind of misleading folks on those choices. Some states have a situation where you have what is called a blanket primary, where whoever, you put all the folks together in one big primary, including unaffiliated Democrat, Republican. Whoever are the top two finishers, regardless of party, they advance November. That's in California. A variation on that is a jungle primary, which is what we have in Louisiana, where you have, on the primary date, you have the top two, but if somebody happens to get 50%, well, they don't even have a general election.
Right.
So there's
regardless of party, right?
Yeah, regardless of party.
So you could have two Democrats on that ballot.
You could have two
I like
Democrats.
that one. I mean, just because it sounds interesting, because it sounds like it's, I mean, I'm not making any sort of policy endorsement. I just think that's fascinating, though, how Louisiana has that. They call it a Cajun primary as well, right? I just read up on this really quickly. What are the disadvantages of that one, though?
Well, the disadvantage is you could be selecting the nominee in a primary rather than a general election, and primaries have a much smaller turnout in general than general elections. So once again, you're having a smaller sliver of the electorate choosing somebody who's going to be the elected official. That may be the most interesting one. Georgia has a slightly different variation where their first round is actually election day, and then they have a runoff in December. That produces its own kind of chaos for federal elections. But yeah, there's a whole lot of interesting things. The question is, which is going to be best for taxpayers and which is going to be, best for people to choose who they vote for? And it's really an open question. It'd be maybe an interesting time to have a debate about that.
Exactly the type of thing that the Civitas Center for Public Integrity should be working on, writing white papers about, studying, and I'm sure that's something that's going to make you busy in the months and years ahead. Let's switch gears a little bit now. Brooke, you've been focusing on the heavy hand of the regulator, and I use hand on purpose because one of the topics that brings this to mind for you is a fight over handbags.
So yes, the Federal Trade Commission has decided they are going to set their sights on ensuring that Coach, which is a well-known luxury brand, and Michael Kors, another well-known luxury brand, cannot merge and create efficiencies within their operations, because that would clearly just make a big market problem for consumers who want to buy luxury handbags, which again, if you're ever buying a luxury handbag, the last thing you expect is for it to be affordable. And so when we're thinking about the FTC's role in the markets, oftentimes conservatives have leaned heavily on the consumer welfare standard. And does this merger harm consumers, or does it help them? But the Federal Trade Commission under Chair Lena Khan has really expanded their understanding and their scope of what is in the consumer's best interest or in the economy's best interest.
Some might even say it's the wrath of Khan. Yeah,
There-
Star Trek
Oh.
reference for you.
Well played. Well played.
Good job, Mitch. I like that.
I like it.
So I think that's sort of at the heart of this is the FTC's penchant for really overstepping its historic bounds, not only when it comes to handbags. I mean, that's fairly frivolous, and most of us could frankly care less. But when it comes to grocery stores, for example, the FTC blocked the merger of Albertsons and Kroger. And they liked to blame their alleged culprit for doing this was because grocery stores are raising all these prices on food. Meanwhile, completely ignoring the overregulation within our food systems, as well as inflation, which was in large part caused by the government. And so it is this sleight of hand, the shifting of blame. And so these regulators at the FTC have really done, I would say, the Biden administration's bidding in this respect, and that's problematic because that does hurt consumers, all in the name of helping consumers. So I don't know. I think that's worth watching and worth people actually paying attention to, especially on the grocery front.
And this also speaks to the legislature, both Congress and state legislators, handing over their authority to executive agencies and allowing these executive agencies too much leeway in order, in how they interpret regulations, and this allows you to have these rogue agencies just willy-nilly
That's
making
exactly
new
right.
rules.
And courts deferring to them. Taking steps designed to help consumers that end up hurting them. We've never seen that before, have we, Donald?
No, we've never heard that. And what's even more mind-boggling to me is that we're not talking about something that's sort of central to life, right? We're not talking about the merger of two power companies or commodities companies that sell flour or eggs or meat or anything. We're talking about handbags, right? This is not something, and even luxury handbags, right? Like, we're not talking about something that's actually unique to national security or public safety or just the welfare of. I mean, we're talking about Coach and Michael Kors handbags, which, I've wandered into a Coach store before, and I felt like I needed to pay money to just walk in, right? So I feel like we've gotten really silly, particularly when we're talking about this deference doctrine that Andy was talking about, where the courts just generally defer to these regulatory agencies to make laws out of air, and it's a problem not only in this instance, right, but when we talk about agriculture and how we get our food, it's also a problem in environmental regulations and a lot of things. And there's a lot of talk at the state level and at the federal level of just sort of rethinking this deference doctrine. And I think that's the next level of regulatory reform that we're going to see the right talk about.
You could say that we need to get a handle on
That's
this.
right. Man, you're just killing on
Yeah,
fire.
rolling, Mitch.
And I should quit on that point, and we will. That's all the time that we have for this week's edition of the Debrief. We hope that you will like, subscribe, do all that great stuff on social media that allows us to continue producing this program. Please join us again next week for another edition of the Debrief.